The crystal glasses did not clean themselves. Zola Adama knew this better than anyone in the Solaria estate, because she was the one who arrived before the sun did. Before the housekeeping supervisor unlocked the supply room, before the kitchen staff began their breakfast preparations, before any living person in that enormous house had opened a single eye. She arrived at 4 in the morning, the way she had arrived every morning for the past 11 months, taking the number 7 bus from the east side and walking the last 6 blocks, because the route did not go as far as the Vance property, and she had never once complained about this to anyone. The Solaria estate sat at the end of a private road, lined with oak trees that were older than the city itself. A house that had been built in 1922 and expanded 4 times since. Each expansion more deliberate than the last, so that the final result was not merely a house, but a statement. The architectural equivalent of a man standing very still in a crowded room and saying nothing while making sure everyone noticed him. Zola noticed it the first morning she arrived and had not noticed it since, because noticing things you cannot change is a luxury, and Zola Adama had very few of those. She let herself in through the service entrance, hung her coat on the hook beside the door, and went directly to the crystal cabinet in the east hallway, where 48 glasses had been set out the previous evening for the ancestral heritage gala that would take place in this house tonight. The event had been on the household calendar for 3 months. The preparations had consumed the last 2 weeks, entirely florists and caterers and lighting specialists moving through the rooms in overlapping shifts, each of them more certain of their own importance than the last. None of them noticing the young woman in the dark uniform who moved among them like water around stones, cleaning what they left behind and arranging what they displaced, and making the house ready in the ways that do not appear on any event planning checklist, but that would be immediately visible in their absence. She took the first glass from the cabinet and held it up to the window, where the first grey light of morning was just beginning to suggest itself against the dark. There was a smudge at the base. She breathed on it, polished it with the cloth she kept in her left apron pocket, held it up again. Better. She set it on the tray and took the next one. Her name was Zola Adama. She was 25 years old. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's hands, and a way of moving through rooms that her colleague Desiree called, like you are trying to apologize for taking, up space, which Zola had not argued with because arguing with accurate observations was a waste of time she did not have. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. She had spent a considerable portion of her 25 years being made aware of this by people who considered the observation useful, and she had spent the rest of those years deciding that the observation was not, in fact, useful, and that what she did with the space she occupied was considerably more important than the amount of it she occupied. She had not yet convinced everyone of this. She was still working on it. The crystal glasses took 40 minutes. When she was done, she moved to the main hallway and began on the floors, using the wide mop with the microfiber head that the housekeeping supervisor had ordered from a specialty supplier in New York, and that Zola had never once complained about having to clean and reassemble after every use. The floors in the Solaria estate were pale marble, the kind that showed every footprint and every smudge and every evidence of human passage, which meant they required attention every morning, regardless of what had happened the previous day and regardless of what was going to happen the next one. This was the thing Zola had found most clarifying about the work. It did not matter what came before or after. The floor needed cleaning now. She was in the east corridor, near the entrance to the main ballroom, when she heard it being moved. The sound was unmistakable, the particular groan of large wheels on marble, the careful instructions being called out in low voices, the sound of something very heavy being navigated through a doorway that was not quite wide enough for it. She stopped mopping and turned to look. And what she saw being wheeled through the double doors of the ballroom was a Steinway concert, grand in a finish, so dark it was almost black. With gold hardware at the hinges and the lid prop and the pedal lyre, and it was the most beautiful object she had seen in 11 months of working in a house full of beautiful objects. Don't even look at it. Desiree had appeared at her elbow, speaking in the low voice she used for things she considered serious. Desiree was 38 years old and had worked at Solaria for 6 years and had the comprehensive knowledge of the house and its rhythms that comes only from that kind of sustained attention. She was the person Zola went to when she needed to understand how something worked in this house. And Desiree delivered such information with the directness of someone who had stopped softening practical advice because softened practical advice was less useful than the direct kind. "I'm just looking," Zola said. "They brought it in from some auction in Vienna. Mr. Vance paid more for that piano than this entire building is worth." Desiree watched the movers navigate the instrument through the doorway with the focused attention of someone monitoring a situation she did not trust. "If you touch it, you will be looking for another job before lunchtime." "I'm not going to touch it." "Good." Desiree looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she wore when she was about to say something she had already decided to say, regardless of the response. "Your father would have loved it." "I expect." Zola turned back to her mop. "Yes," she said. "He would have." She did not say anything else. And Desiree, who understood when a subject was finished, moved on to the next item on her morning checklist without pursuing it. But Zola stood for another moment in the corridor, holding the mop handle, looking at the space where the Steinway had disappeared through the double doors into the ballroom, and she thought about her father. Curvy Adama had been a small man with enormous hands and the particular patience of someone who had decided very early that the work itself was the point and everything else was secondary. He had repaired instruments for 40 years in a workshop not much larger than the supply room at Solaria, working on pianos and violins, and occasionally things that did not have names in English. Brought to him by musicians who had heard that he understood what was wrong before you explained it to him. He had also been, though this was not something he spoke about in the workshop or anywhere else, a composer. He had been working on a piece for the last 12 years of his life, a piece built on musical traditions from the region of Ghana, where his own father had been born, something that existed at the intersection of what he knew academically and what he carried in a part of himself that did not have an academic name. He had played it for Zola the winter before he died, in the small room behind the workshop where he kept the upright piano he had rebuilt from parts over the course of 4 years, and she had sat on the floor with her back against the wall and listened to the whole of it without speaking. She had not spoken after it either, for a moment. Then she had said, "Papa, that is not yours to keep." He had looked at her. "What do you mean?" "It belongs to everyone who needs it," she said. "You have to let it go." He had smiled at her, the particular smile of a man who has been understood by the person whose understanding matters most to him. He had not let it go in time. He had died before the piece was published, before the rights were properly established, before the legal structures that protect a work were in place. And into that gap had stepped Marcus Sterling. And what happened next was not something Zola allowed herself to think about on working mornings, because thinking about it made her hands unsteady, and she needed her hands to be steady for the crystal glasses. She picked up the mop. The marble floor was not going to clean itself. Outside the windows of the Solaria estate, the morning came in the way. Atlanta mornings come in autumn slowly, then all at once. The light moving from gray to gold in the space of 10 minutes, as if the city had been waiting for permission. In the ballroom, the Steinway sat in the center of the room like something that had decided where it wanted to be, and had communicated this preference clearly to the people responsible for placing it. A single spotlight had been positioned above it at an angle that the lighting specialist had spent 40 minutes adjusting. In the full light of the morning, with no one in the room and no event yet underway, It looked like the kind of object that existed primarily to make people understand what the word beautiful was actually for. Zola did not go into the ballroom. She finished the corridor and moved to the next one, and the morning continued, and the house woke up around her the way it always did. And by the time the first of the event staff arrived at 7:30, there was no evidence that anyone had been there before them. That was, as Desiree had told her once with the brisk approval she gave to things done correctly, exactly the point. The cars began arriving at 7 in the evening. Zola watched them from the service corridor window. The long black vehicles pulling up to the front entrance, one after another, with the unhurried precision of a convoy that has been carefully timed and knows it. Men in evening dress and women in gowns that cost more than Zola earned in a year stepped out onto the lit stone and moved toward the entrance with the ease of people for whom this kind of event was simply a Tuesday. The particular ease that comes not from being comfortable in formal settings, but from having never experienced any other kind. She did not watch for long. There was too much to do. The evening proceeded the way large events at Solaria always proceeded, in layers. Each layer visible only from a certain position in the house, from the front of the house, in the main reception rooms, and the ballroom. The event was a thing of beauty. 200 guests in their finest. The sound of conversation and music, and the particular quality of laughter that belongs to rooms where everyone has something to prove. From the service corridors and the kitchen and the back hallways where the staff moved, the event was something else entirely, a logistical operation of considerable complexity, requiring the coordination of 37 people over the course of 6 hours to ensure that what appeared effortless in the front of the house remained effortless, which required a great deal of effort in the back. Zola was assigned to the main reception room for the first 2 hours, circulating with a tray of champagne glasses, refilling when necessary, removing empties, remaining close enough to be useful and far enough away to be invisible. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The trick, she had discovered in 11 months of practice, was not to make yourself small, which was impossible and also ineffective, but to make yourself expected, to move with the rhythm of the room in a way that made your presence seem like a natural feature of it rather than an addition to it. She was crossing from the far end of the reception room to the refreshment table when it happened. Camille Dupont was standing near the center of the room with 3 other women, holding a glass of red wine in a way that suggested she was less interested in the wine than in being seen holding it. She was 28 years old and had the particular quality of beauty that comes from having been told about it so frequently and from such an early age that it had become less a feature of her appearance than a feature of her personality. She wore a dress that Zola recognized from a magazine she had seen in the household recycling 2 weeks earlier, and her diamond necklace caught the light at a frequency that seemed almost deliberate. Zola did not look at Camille Dupont. She looked at the path to the refreshment table and moved along it. Tray steady. Steps even. She was 2 feet away when the glass left Camille's hand. It did not fall the way things fall when they slip. It fell the way things fall when they are released, with a slight forward momentum that sent the red wine in an arc across the pale marble floor and left the glass intact at the end of it, which told Zola, in the half-second before the attention of the room shifted, exactly what had happened. Oh, no. Camille's voice was not apologetic. It was the voice of someone announcing a problem they have no intention of solving. Someone made a mess. The women around her stepped back from the wine on the floor. Zola set her tray on the nearest surface and went to the supply closet she had identified on her first week, which was 12 steps from the reception room entrance and contained the materials she needed. She was back in 45 seconds with a cleaning cloth and a small bottle of the specific solution that worked on red wine on marble without leaving a residue. She knelt on the floor. The laughter started immediately. It was not loud. It was the kind of laughter that does not need to be loud to carry, the kind that is aimed with precision, and Camille Dupont's aim had clearly been practiced. Look at her go. Camille set her empty hand against her collarbone in a gesture of theatrical observation. You know, I have always said there is something admirable about a woman who knows exactly what she is suited for. She looked down at Zola on the floor with the expression of someone making an observation they consider generous. With that figure, you really are much better suited to the kitchen than to carrying trays through a reception. All that moving around, bumping into things. The women around her made the sounds that women make when they are not willing to laugh directly, but want the person laughing to know they are not opposed to it. Zola kept her attention on the marble. The solution was working. The stain was coming out cleanly. I am sorry for the inconvenience, Zola said. Her voice was even and not quiet. She had learned that apologizing quietly, in situations like this one, communicated something different than the words being spoken. And she was not interested in communicating that. I will have this cleaned up in just a moment. Of course you will. Camille watched her work with the focused attention of someone who finds the spectacle genuinely interesting. That is, after all, what you are here for. Zola pressed the cloth to the marble, lifted it, pressed again. The wine was nearly gone. She had done this before, with other spills, in other rooms. And she had learned that the task itself was the best place to put her attention when conversations of this kind were happening around her, because the task was honest and the conversation was not. And honesty was always the more reliable ground to stand on. She was almost finished when she became aware of a change in the room. It was not a sound exactly. It was an absence of sound, a small but distinct reduction in the ambient noise of the reception, the kind of reduction that happens when a room becomes aware of something. She did not look up immediately. She finished cleaning the floor, folded the cloth, capped the bottle, and stood. Then she looked. From the second-floor balcony that overlooked the reception room, a man was standing at the railing. He was not leaning on it. He was simply standing, with his hands at his sides and his attention on the room below. And the room below had become aware of this in the particular way that rooms become aware of Malik Vance, not because he announced himself, but because the space around him changed quality when he was in it, the way temperature changes quality when something very cold enters a warm room. He was 36 years old, though he looked neither older nor younger than that, simply like a man who occupied his age the way he occupied his suit, with the ease of someone who had stopped thinking about it. He had the build of someone who had once been an athlete and had subsequently found other things to do with that physical capability. And he had the face of someone who had spent a long time learning to make it reveal exactly what he chose and nothing else. His eyes, from the distance of the balcony, were dark and entirely still. He was looking at Zola, not at the scene that had just occurred, at Zola, with the specific attention of someone who has noticed something and is in the process of deciding what to do with the noticing. Camille Dupont turned to follow the direction of several other gazes that had gone up to the balcony, and when she saw Malik Vance standing there, she smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who had rehearsed the expression for exactly this audience. He did not return it. He looked at her for one moment with an expression that was entirely neutral, which in his face communicated considerably more than neutrality. And then he looked back at Zola. Zola picked up her tray and her cleaning supplies and moved toward the service exit. She did not hurry. She did not look up at the balcony again. She went back to the supply closet, returned the materials to their correct positions, picked up a fresh tray of champagne from the kitchen, and returned to the reception room to continue her work. The spill was gone. The floor was clean. The evening continued. From the balcony, the man who owned all of it watched the reception room for another moment, and then he turned and went back inside. The challenge was announced at 10 in the evening. By that point, the Ancestral Heritage Gala had been underway for 3 hours, and the 200 guests had moved through the arc that large formal events always move through: the early energy of arrival and greeting, the middle period of food and conversation, and then the late settling into the particular warmth of an event that has been going well and knows it. The ballroom was lit from above and below, the Steinway at its center, catching the light from multiple angles and giving it back in a way that made it look less like a piece of furniture than like an argument. Around it, the guests stood in the configurations of people who have been in the same room for several hours and have found the arrangements that suit them. Malik Vance stood at the front of the room and waited for quiet, which arrived quickly, the way quiet always arrived when he indicated he wanted it. "This evening," he said, in the voice he used for rooms that needed to be addressed rather than entertained, "honors something that cannot be purchased, cannot be inherited, and cannot be manufactured by any amount of money applied to any amount of time. It honors the tradition of making things that outlast the maker." He paused, in the way of someone who is comfortable with silence in large rooms. "My foundation has spent the last 6 years working to recover, preserve, and celebrate musical traditions from the African continent that were nearly lost. Tonight, I want to demonstrate what is at stake when we allow those traditions to disappear." He turned to the Steinway. "This instrument is going to be used tonight," he said, "for something that has not been attempted in a public setting in this country. The piece is called Lost Chant of the Sun. It was composed within the musical tradition of the Ashanti Kingdom, and it was adapted for the concert piano by a musicologist whose work my foundation has been supporting for the past 4 years. It requires complete memorization. It requires a level of technical facility that most professional pianists find prohibitive, and it requires something that cannot be taught in any conservatory, an understanding of why it was written." He looked at the room. "If any woman in this room can perform this piece from memory, without error, I will make her a promise." He said the next words with the deliberate pace of someone who has chosen them carefully and wants them to land correctly. "I will marry her, and I will transfer half of the Solaria Heritage Fund, currently valued at $100 million, into a trust in her name, to be used for the continuation of African musical heritage work for the next 50 years. The room absorbed this. Then it began to react laughter, the kind that is not dismissive, but genuinely surprised. The sound of 200 people processing something they had not expected to hear at a formal gala. Conversation erupted in clusters. Several women exchanged looks. Several men looked at the women nearest to them with the expression of people doing rapid calculations. 3 women were approached within the first 5 minutes. A concert pianist from New York who had performed at Carnegie Hall 6 times and who shook her head slowly when the piece was placed in front of her, saying only that she would need 6 months of preparation minimum. A music professor from Spelman College who studied the score for 4 minutes and then set it down with the expression of someone who has identified a problem that is larger than the available tools. A young woman who had been a child prodigy and had a recording contract and who looked at the opening bars and said, with the honesty of someone who respects the work, "This is not a piece you perform. This is a piece you become. I am not there yet." The room quieted. The challenge sat in the air, the way challenges sit when everyone present has understood simultaneously that no one is going to take it. Malik Vance stood near the Steinway and watched this happen without any particular expression. He did not seem disappointed. He seemed, if anything, patient. The way a person seems patient when they are waiting for something specific and are not yet certain it is going to arrive. At the far end of the ballroom, near the service entrance, Zola Adama stood with a tray of sparkling water and listened to the piece being described, and felt something move through her that had no name in the language she was currently thinking in. She knew the piece. She had heard it. Not a recording. Not a performance. but the original, her father's voice, humming the melodic line while he worked in the workshop, adjusting the tuning pins on someone's upright. The tune coming out of him, the way tunes come out of people who have spent so long with a piece of music that it has become part of the way they breathe. She had heard him play sections of it on the upright in the back room, not as performance but as thought, the way some people talk to themselves. She had heard the full arc of it the winter before he died. She knew every note. The laughter, when it came from the section nearest to her, landed differently than Zola had expected. She had thought she was prepared for the noise of the room. She had been in this room all evening, managing the distance between herself and what was happening in it with the practiced efficiency of 11 months of exactly this work. She knew how to be present and absent at the same time. She knew how to let the sound of other people's evenings move past her without settling. But this laughter was not about the challenge in the abstract. This laughter was the laughter of people who found the gap between what had just been asked and what was available in the room genuinely funny. And in that gap, in the space between the request and the absence of anyone willing to meet it, Zola heard something else, the sound of her father's work being treated as decoration, as the backdrop for an elegant evening, as a thing that could be proposed and declined and moved past, a thing without consequence. She thought about the winter before he died. She thought about the back room of the workshop and the upright piano he had rebuilt from parts. She thought about what he had said when she told him the piece did not belong only to him. He had smiled and agreed, and then died before anyone else had the chance to hear it. She thought about what had happened to the rights to his research. She thought about Marcus Sterling, who was in this room right now, within 30 feet of her, standing near the bar with a glass of something amber and the relaxed posture of a man who has never once considered that the ground under him might not be entirely solid. She set the tray down on the service table. She had not planned this. She wanted to be precise about that. Even in the privacy of her own thinking, this was not a plan. A plan required preparation, calculation, an understanding of what would happen next. What she was doing was simpler than a plan and more dangerous than one. She was responding to something she had heard, the way a tuning fork responds to a frequency that matches it, not by decision, but by resonance. She untied the apron from her waist. She folded it and set it on the service table next to the tray. She smoothed the front of her dark uniform with both hands, a gesture that was not about vanity, but about readiness. The thing you do before you begin something that requires all of you. She began to walk toward the Steinway. The room noticed before she was halfway across it, not because she announced herself, but because the room had been quiet with the particular quiet of a challenge that has gone unanswered. And movement in that kind of quiet is visible in a way that movement in noise is not. She was aware of the attention shifting without looking at it, the way you are aware of weather without seeing it. What is she doing? Someone said this at a low volume that was designed to carry. Is that one of the serving staff? Someone laughed. Then, someone else. The sound was not mean. Exactly. Which in some ways made it worse. It was the sound of a room that has found something unexpected and is not yet sure whether to take it seriously. Camille Dupont, who had moved from the reception room to the ballroom an hour earlier and had positioned herself near enough to the front to be seen, turned to look at Zola with the expression she had worn in the reception room, the expression of someone watching a thing happen that they find both amusing and faintly beneath them. She took a small step forward, as if to intercept. Malik Vance raised his hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply a hand lifted, palm, out, in the direction of the room, and it stopped everything. Camille's step, the sound of the laughter, the low tide of conversation that had been building. He did not say anything. He lowered his hand and looked at Zola, who was still walking. and his expression had changed from the patience of someone waiting to the attention of someone who has begun to understand that what they were waiting for may have just arrived. Zola reached the piano bench. She stood before it for one moment, not performing the pause, but existing in it. And then she sat down. She looked at the keys. They were the same keys, 88 of them, the same as every piano she had ever played, the same as the upright in her father's back room, the same as the practice room piano at the community center, 3 blocks from her apartment, where she went twice a week when her shift ended, and paid $4 an hour to sit in a room by herself and play. The same keys. She took off her gloves. She had worn thin cottonwork gloves all evening, as she always did, to protect the crystal glasses from fingerprints. She set them on the edge of the bench. Her hands, without the gloves, were her father's hands, large, with knuckles that had known work, with calluses in the places where calluses accumulate on people who use their hands for a living, and in other places too. The places where calluses accumulate on people who play piano. She placed her hands on the keys and did not yet press them. The room was entirely still. She thought about her father, not the winter of the back room, not the piece itself, but earlier. She was 10 years old, standing beside the repair bench while he worked on a harpsichord that someone had brought in from a museum collection, and he had said to her, without looking up from the tuning pin he was adjusting, "Every instrument is waiting. Zola, you do not make it play, you allow it to begin." She allowed it to begin. The first note was a single tone in the middle register. It was not the dramatic opening that the room might have expected, because Zola was not performing for the room, and the piece did not begin dramatically. It began the way certain kinds of truth begin, quietly, with the patience of something that has been waiting a long time and is in no hurry now that it has finally arrived. A single note, held for 2 full beats, and then a second note, a major third above it, and then the 2 of them together, and then the melody began to move. The piece was built on a rhythmic foundation that came from drum patterns in the traditional music of the Ashanti Kingdom, translated into the left hand of the piano in a way that was not merely imitative but transformative, carrying the weight and the forward motion of the original without pretending to be the original. Over this foundation, the right hand carried a melodic line that moved in intervals that were unfamiliar to ears trained only on Western classical music. Intervals that seemed at first to be arriving at unexpected places and then, with repetition, revealed themselves to be arriving at exactly the right places. Places that were right, not according to the theory that had been written down and taught in conservatories, but according to something older than that, something that had been passed from generation to generation in the way that things which matter are always passed, not through documents, but through memory. Zola played it from memory. She had not played it in 4 months, since the last time she had gone to the community center, and the practice room had been available, and she had had enough time. She had not played it before an audience since the last time her father was alive. In the back room of the workshop, with just the 2 of them, and the smell of wood polish and metal, and the particular quality of silence that existed in that room after music. But it was in her, the way the things your father teaches you are in you, not as information, but as knowledge. The difference being that information can be lost and knowledge cannot, not the kind that matters. She played through the first movement, which was structured like a conversation between 2 people who know each other well enough to disagree productively. She played through the second, which was structured like grief that has been given time and has not softened but has deepened into something livable. She reached the third movement, which was the difficult one, the one with the cross-hand passages that the concert pianist from New York had declined after reading the opening bars. And she played it without hesitation because she had played it 500 times in the back room of the workshop and 200 times in the community center practice room, and she had memorized not just the notes, but the decisions that the notes required, the choices about weight and pace, and the relationship between the hands that you cannot write into a score, but that must be felt to be made correctly. The room had stopped making any sound at all after the first 30 seconds, not the careful quiet of people trying to be polite, but the involuntary quiet of people who have stopped thinking about themselves. There is a difference. Zola could feel the difference, not because she was paying attention to the room, but because the room had stopped existing as a separate thing and had become instead a space that the music was filling. And when that happens, you can feel the filling the way. You can feel the pressure in a room change when a window opens. Camille Dupont had not sat down. She was standing where she had been standing when she took the step that Malik Vance had stopped with one raised hand, and she was standing very still. And the expression on her face was not the one she had worn in the reception room or at any point in the preceding evening. It was the expression of someone who has encountered something that does not fit any category they have prepared, and who does not yet know what to do with the absence of a category. Malik Vance had sat down. This was noted by several people in the room because Malik Vance did not sit when he was in public settings unless the event specifically required it, and this event did not require it. And he had been standing since the challenge was announced. He sat now in the chair nearest to the piano, not the one that had been designated as his for the evening, just the nearest one. And he leaned forward slightly with his elbows on his knees and looked at Zola's hands on the keys with the expression of a man who is watching something he is going to remember for a long time and knows it. The third movement required the left hand to cross over the right at 3 distinct points in the sequence, a technical demand that was not merely about the mechanics of the crossing, but about maintaining the continuity of both melodic lines through the interruption of the physical action. Zola executed each crossing without breaking the line, because her father had taught her that the crossing was not the point. The continuity was the point. The crossing was just what you had to do to maintain it. It was, he had said once, a metaphor for something he chose not to name. She played the final phrase. It resolved on a chord that should not have resolved, by the standards of the Western theory that governed the room she was sitting in, on what it resolved on, and yet it resolved completely. The way things resolve, when the logic they are operating within is older than the logic you have been taught to apply to them. The chord hung in the air for the duration of a breath, and then it was done. Zola lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. Then Malik Vance stood up. He stood up, and he looked at her and he said, "Name your request." The 4 words fell into the silence of the ballroom with the weight of a promise made publicly by a man who was understood, by everyone in the room, to keep his promises. The 200 guests were looking at Zola. The lighting specialist had not moved. The musicians in the corner had set down their instruments. The servers near the kitchen entrance had stopped moving. Zola sat for a moment longer at the piano bench. She had not planned what came next, which was a problem she had now, because what happened next was going to happen in front of 200 people and would be the kind of thing that was discussed afterward, and she wanted it to be the right thing. She thought about the piece she had just played. She thought about the room in the house where it could be played again, and the documents that would need to exist for it to continue to exist beyond this evening. She stood from the bench. "I would like," she said, in the voice she used when she was being precise about something that mattered, to be given access to the music library. She looked directly at Malik Vance, the one on the 3rd floor, the one that is kept locked. A small sound moved through the room. Not laughter, something else. Malik Vance looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than the moments that had preceded it. Then, without explanation, he said, "Done." He said it in the way of someone who has already decided something and is simply confirming it out loud. He said it without the pause that would have indicated surprise, which told Zola, in the quarter second that she had to process this, that he was not surprised by her request, which told her something she filed away for later. The room began to breathe again. Conversation resumed in the scattered way of conversations that are resuming after something has interrupted them, each cluster finding its own way back. Camille Dupont turned to the woman beside her and said something in a low voice. The musicians picked up their instruments. The servers began to move again. But in the center of the room, near the Steinway that had come from an auction in Vienna, Malik Vance was still looking at Zola with the same expression he had worn when he sat down during the third movement, the expression of a man who has seen something and is deciding what to do with what he has seen. He said one more thing, quietly enough that it was meant only for her. You knew that piece before tonight. It was not a question. Zola looked at him for one full second. Then she picked up the cotton gloves from the edge of the piano bench and put them back on. Yes, she said. I did. She went back to work. Malik Vance did not sleep that night. This was not, in itself, unusual. He was a man who did not require the full 8 hours that most people required, who had trained himself over the course of his professional life to function at the level he needed to function on 6 hours, or sometimes 5, and who used the hours between midnight and 2 in the morning with the same intentionality he used the daylight ones. But tonight was different from the ordinary working insomnia, because tonight his mind was not on the 14 items that remained on his professional calendar for the coming week, or on the negotiation that had been ongoing for 3 months, with a media consortium in London, or on any of the things that ordinarily occupied the late hours. Tonight, his mind was on a woman playing a piano in a room full of people who did not expect her to be able to do it, and doing it better than anyone in the room could have done it, including the people who were there specifically because they were supposed to be good at that. At 12:40 in the morning, he called the head of his security and intelligence team, a man named Chen, who had been with him for 9 years and who answered his phone on the first ring regardless of the hour, because this was the arrangement they had established, and Chen was a man who honored arrangements. I need a full background on a member of the household staff, Malik said. Her name is Zola Adama. She has been employed at Solaria for approximately 11 months. I want everything: family history, education, any documentation related to musical training, any documentation related to her father. Chen asked 2 clarifying questions and took the name and said it would be done by morning. Malik sat at his desk in the study that overlooked the south garden and thought about the piece she had played. He had heard it before, twice, once on a recording that his foundation's musicologist had made of a partial performance in Accra, and once in a transcription that the same musicologist had spent 4 years creating from field recordings and archival materials. He knew the piece. He knew its history. He knew the name of the man who had spent his life on it. He knew the name Curvy Adama. He sat at the desk until 3 in the morning, and then he went to bed. And in the morning, the report from Chen was on his phone, and he read it before he had finished his first cup of coffee. And when he was done reading it, he sat for a long time without doing anything else. Then he called Chen back. The situation with Marcus Sterling. He said, the intellectual property dispute from 4 years ago. I want the documentation on my desk today. Chen said it would be there. The report on Zola Adama ran to 14 pages. Malik read all of it. He read it the way he read things that mattered slowly, with the kind of attention that treats every sentence as if it might contain something that the next sentence depends on, because in his experience, it usually did. He read about her childhood in a neighborhood on the east side of Atlanta where the streets were named for Confederate generals who had been dead for 150 years, whose names the current residents had been petitioning to change for a decade. He read about her mother, who had left when Zola was 9, and who had not maintained contact. He read about her father, who had raised her alone from that point forward, in the workshop that was also their home, in the building that was also their entire world for the years that followed. He read about Curvy Adama. The report was factual. The way security reports are factual. It documented. It did not interpret. But what it documented was enough. Curvy Adama had been what Chen's team called a specialist in traditional African musical instruments, with a secondary focus on compositional work, incorporating those traditions. He had been, in the language that people who actually knew music used and that did not appear in security reports, something closer to a genius. A man who had spent 40 years at the intersection of ethnomusicology and composition and had produced, in those 40 years, a body of work that was unlike anything else being made in that space, which meant it was not commercially valuable in any immediate sense and was extraordinarily valuable in every other sense. He had also been, for the last 12 years of his life, working on a piece that he called, in the notebooks that his daughter had kept after his death, the conversation I am trying to finish with the music that made me. Marcus Sterling had met Curvy Adama at a cultural event in Atlanta 6 years before Curvy died. Sterling was at that time building what he called an African cultural heritage portfolio, which meant he was acquiring rights to musical and artistic works produced by African and African American creators at prices that reflected his assessment of their market value rather than their actual value. And his assessment was consistently low, because his knowledge of what he was acquiring was consistently thin. He had acquired the rights to Curvy Adama's body of work through a contract that Curvy had signed in a state of documented financial desperation, for a sum that Malik's team calculated was approximately 3% of what the rights were worth on the open market at that time, and a considerably smaller percentage of what they were worth now. The contract had been legal. That was the most important thing in the report. And Malik read it 3 times. The contract had been legal. Curvy had signed it. The signature had been his. The terms had been written in standard legal language. What had not been standard was Sterling's conduct before the signing, which Chen's report documented through a series of financial transactions that showed Sterling had deliberately accelerated the debt pressure on Curvy in the months before the contract was presented, through the purchase and calling in of 3 small loans that Curvy had taken from institutions in which Sterling had a silent ownership stake. Not illegal, documented, which was a different thing, and in Malik's experience, sometimes more useful. Zola had been 19 when the contract was signed. She had been 21 when her father died. She had been paying off the debts that Sterling's actions had created, and working every job that was available to her, and practicing piano in a community center practice room twice a week, and learning the piece her father had spent 12 years on for the past 4 years. Malik finished the report and closed his phone and looked at the South Garden, where the November morning was doing what November mornings in Atlanta do, making itself available to people with the time and the inclination to notice it, and being entirely indifferent to people who were not. He had the inclination. He did not currently have the time. He picked up the phone and called his foundation's legal director. Marcus Sterling arrived at the Solaria Foundation donor dinner with the ease of a man who had been to enough of these events that they had stopped requiring any particular attention from him, which was the most dangerous state for a man like Marcus Sterling to be in, though he did not know this. He was 61 years old, broad across the shoulders in a way that had been athletic 30 years ago and had subsequently become something else, and he wore his wealth the way certain men wear it, not to be seen wearing it, but to make it clear that wearing it requires no effort. His suit had been made for him in London. His watch had been made for him in Geneva. His confidence had been assembled over 61 years from the materials that confidence is assembled from, when no one has ever said no to you for long enough to make it stick. He had not thought about Kofi Adama in 2 years. He noticed Zola approximately 40 minutes into the dinner, when she was crossing the room with a tray of champagne flutes. He did not recognize her immediately. He registered her as the kind of large, dark-skinned woman he tended to register as part of the background of events like this one, the way you register furniture or lighting, as feature of the room rather than person in it. Then something made him look again, and he saw the angle of her face, and he saw the hands, and he saw the quality of her movement across the room, which was not the movement of someone who believes they are background. He knew then. He had met her once, briefly, 4 years ago, at a meeting that had not been about her, but that she had attended as her father's representative. As Kofi had been too unwell to come himself, she had sat in the meeting and not spoken, and watched with the kind of attention that he had noticed at the time, and then not thought about again. He put his champagne flute down on the nearest surface and crossed the room toward her. She did not stop walking when she saw him coming. She adjusted her route slightly to maintain the distance she was already maintaining between herself and the guests she was serving. And she kept the tray level and her face neutral, and he understood, watching her do this, that she had known he was in the room already and had made a decision about how to handle it. And the decision had been to handle it by maintaining exactly this quality of professional distance. He did not let her maintain it. He moved to intercept her at the edge of the room nearest to the corridor, and he did it in the way of someone who has the right to intercept anyone at an event he is attending as a guest, of honor, and he stepped in front of her, close enough that she had to stop or walk into him. She stopped. Kofi Adama's daughter, he said. He said it as if naming a category rather than a person. I thought that was you. Zola held the tray level. Mr. Sterling. Your father. He tilted his head in a gesture that might have been sympathy and was not. A sad business. He had real talent. Your father. He simply lacked the business instincts to do anything with it. He looked at the tray in her hands, and then at her face, with the expression of someone conducting an assessment. Seems to run in the family. He put his foot out. It was a small movement, not dramatic, the kind of movement that could be described afterward as accidental if anyone were to describe it at all. The toe of his shoe caught the edge of Zola's foot and she stumbled, catching herself before the tray tilted, catching herself completely, the strength in her arms absorbing the interruption with a steadiness that he had not accounted for. She did not fall. She did not spill anything. She straightened. Your father was a failure, Sterling said, in the flat voice of a man stating something he has decided is simply true, and you are exactly where the daughter of a failure belongs, serving the people who know how to do what he could not. The world is not unfair, girl. It is simply honest about what things are worth. He turned to go back to his table. He had taken 2 steps when he stopped. Malik Vance was standing in his path. He had not appeared from anywhere dramatic. He had simply been on the other side of the room and was now here, in the way of a man who moves through spaces with enough authority that the movement itself tends not to be noticed until it has already happened. He looked at Marcus Sterling with an expression that contained nothing that could be described as anger and everything that could be described as decision. Then he turned to Zola. He reached out and took the tray from her hands, gently, with both hands under the base of it, the way you handle something you are treating with care, and he set it on the nearest surface. He did this without asking and without explaining. And then he turned back to face Marcus Sterling and the room that had, in the preceding 30 seconds, gone very quiet. Marcus. His voice was conversational, which in the context of his expression made it something else. You have been a guest of this foundation for 4 years. You have attended 6 events. You have made, in that time, no contributions to the work of cultural preservation that this foundation exists to support. You have attended the events because attending them is useful to your reputation. And I have permitted this because I was building a case, and building a case takes time. He paused. I am done building it. Sterling's face had done several things in the course of this speech. It had moved from confidence to recalibration to something that was working hard to remain in the category of disdain, but was experiencing pressure from adjacent categories. The man you just described as a failure, Malik said, spent 40 years creating work that your lawyers paid 3% of its value for, during a period of financial distress that your own financial instruments created. This is documented. The documentation is currently with my foundation's legal team and will be with the relevant authorities by the end of this week. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The work you purchased belongs, by rights of creative origin that supersede the contract you had him sign, to the tradition it came from, and to the people who carry that tradition forward. He looked at Sterling for a moment longer, with the specific patience of someone who has already decided what happens next and is simply allowing the other person time to understand it. The man whose memory you chose to insult in this room tonight left behind something that your money cannot touch and your lawyers cannot reach, he said. His daughter played it last week in front of 200 people, and not one person in that room breathed for 12 minutes. He paused. That is what a legacy looks like. Marcus, yours looks considerably different. He turned back to Zola. Sterling said something. It was not something that the room was able to catch precisely, though several people tried, and it fell into the space that Malik's words had already filled and did not change anything that those words had established. Sterling left the dinner 35 minutes later, before dessert was served, which was noted by several people and commented upon by several more. Zola stood where she was, without the tray, her hands at her sides, and looked at Malik Vance. You already knew, she said. It was not a question. About your father, about Sterling, about the contract. He looked at her steadily. Yes. Since when? Since the morning after the gala. She absorbed this. And the challenge, the peace. The peace was real, he said. The challenge was real. What I did not know was whether the person who could meet it was already in the room. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to understand. Was simply how he looked at things he considered important directly, without the social softening that most people applied to direct attention. Now I know. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the tray from the surface where he had set it, because it needed to be returned to the kitchen, and because the work that needed doing did not stop being the work that needed doing because the evening had become something other than what it started as. I need to finish my shift, she said. He nodded. He stepped aside and let her pass. She walked to the kitchen. Behind her, the dinner resumed, and the room had the particular quality it gets when something has happened that everyone present will remember and nobody is quite ready to discuss yet. She pushed through the kitchen door and set the tray on the counter and stood for a moment with her hands on the edge of the stainless steel and breathed. Then she picked up a fresh tray and went back to work. A year is a long time for some things and not long enough for others. In the year that followed the Ancestral Heritage Gala and the donor dinner and the confrontation with Marcus Sterling in the Solaria Foundation dining room, a number of things happened in sequence, and some of them happened in parallel, which is how important things tend to happen when they are actually important. The legal process that Malik's team had initiated moved at the pace that legal processes move at when they are well-resourced and carefully documented, which was slower than Zola would have liked and faster than Sterling had expected. By the end of the 8th month, the contract that Curvy Adama had signed under conditions of manufactured financial distress had been successfully contested in civil court on the grounds of coercive commercial practices, and the rights to his body of work had been transferred to a trust established in his name with Zola as its sole administrator. In the same period, Zola had left the staff at Solaria, because remaining on staff while the legal case was ongoing was a conflict of interest that Malik's attorneys had identified in the second month, and that Zola had agreed to resolve by leaving, though she had not left easily. She had found work at a music school on the west side of the city, teaching piano to children between the ages of 7 and 14, 4 days a week. And she had continued going to the community center practice room on the days she was not teaching, though she no longer needed to pay $4 an hour because the school had a piano she was permitted to use in the evenings. She and Malik had spoken many times in the course of the year, by phone and in person, in contexts that were formally about the legal case and informally about other things, in the way that conversations between two people who have decided to pay attention to each other tend to move from the formally relevant to the informally significant, without announcing the transition. The night of the performance at the Atlanta Music Hall, which Solaria Foundation had helped restore to use after a decade of sitting empty, Zola played the program she had chosen, a set of pieces that moved from the Western classical tradition through the African traditional tradition and into the space where her father had spent his life working, the space that belonged to both and to neither, the space that was its own thing. She played for 90 minutes to a full house. She played the piece her father had written, in its complete form, for the first time before an audience of more than 2 people. When it ended, Malik Vance walked onto the stage. He had told her he was coming to the performance. He had not told her he was going to walk onto the stage. She stood at the piano and watched him come, and her expression was the one she wore when something was happening that she had not planned for, which was the expression she wore less often than she used to. He stopped in front of her. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a ring, a band of dark metal set with a black diamond, the stone deep and clear in the stage light, the kind of object that had been made to last. He held it in the flat of his hand rather than opening a box, which was the gesture of someone presenting something rather than proposing a transaction. "I told a room full of people a year ago," he said, "that I would marry the woman who could play that piece." He looked at her. "I was wrong about the terms of the offer. The offer should not have been conditional. The offer should have been, I want to spend my life in the company of someone for whom music is not a performance but a truth. And I have found that person." He paused. "That is the correct offer. The ring is the same." Zola looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at him. The house behind her was very quiet. 2,000 people not making a sound, which was a different kind of quiet than the ballroom quiet of a year ago, and the same kind in the ways that mattered. "You should have led with that," she said. He almost smiled. "I know." She took the ring from his hand. The children arrived at 9 in the morning on Saturdays, which was early enough that some of them were not fully awake when they came through the door, but late enough that the light in the Solaria estate's reconfigured east wing was warm and good, the kind of light that makes a room feel like a place. Something can begin. The east wing had been a formal dining room and a series of reception spaces. It was now a music education program, serving 42 children from the east side of Atlanta. Children whose families could not afford music lessons, and who had been identified through the school system and through community organizations as children who had shown some interest in or aptitude for music. Though interest was weighted more heavily than aptitude in the selection, because aptitude was something you developed, and interest was the thing that made you develop it. There were 6 upright pianos in the main room, 2 guitar stations, a music theory area with a whiteboard and small tables, and in the corner, under a window that looked out over the South Garden, one concert grand, not the Steinway from Vienna, which was in the performance space, a different one, older, that Malik had found at an estate sale in Savannah and had shipped to Atlanta and had restored by a technician whose name, when Zola saw it on the invoice, made her stand, very still, for a moment. The technician was someone her father had trained. On Saturday mornings, Zola taught the beginners. She sat at one of the upright pianos and showed them where to place their hands, and she told them what her father had told her about allowing the instrument to begin rather than making it play. And she watched their faces when they pressed a key for the first time and heard what happened. That expression, which was the same on every child regardless of age or background. The expression of someone who has understood for the first time that they can make something that did not exist a second ago, was the expression she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it, and finding it 42 times on 42 different faces over the course of a Saturday morning was the best part of every week. Malik watched from the doorway. He did not come into the room on Saturday mornings, because Saturday mornings in this room belonged to something that had nothing to do with him, and he understood this clearly enough not to intrude on it. He stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee and watched his wife move between the piano benches, stopping to adjust a hand position here, to demonstrate a phrase there, to sit beside a 7-year-old who was frustrated and play the thing slowly enough that the frustration could see where it was going. He had been told, by people who analyzed these things, that the program's outcomes in its first year were exceptional, that the children who participated showed measurable improvement in academic focus and in the emotional regulation metrics that the partner schools tracked. He read these reports carefully, the way he read everything, and he believed them, and they were not the reason he stood in the doorway on Saturday mornings. He stood in the doorway because Zola was in the room, and because watching her in the room was something he had not expected to be what it was, which was the most useful thing he did on Saturdays. Useful in the sense that it reminded him, in a way that nothing in the professional world could remind him, of what things were for. The money was for this. The foundation was for this. The 40 years of work that Curvy Adama had spent in a workshop, making instruments sing again, and composing the music that nobody had listened to until his daughter played it in a ballroom, was for this. These 42 children pressing piano keys for the first time on a Saturday morning in a room that used to be a formal dining room, making sounds that had not existed in the world before they made them. At the front of the room, Zola helped a small girl in a yellow sweater find the note she was looking for. The girl found it. Her face did the thing. Zola smiled, the smile she wore when that happened, not the smile of a teacher pleased with a student, but the smile of someone who has just been reminded of something they already knew and are glad to know again. Outside the windows, the South Garden was doing what Atlanta gardens do in late autumn, holding on to what it has with the patience of things that have learned to trust the return of warmth. The light came through the windows and lay across the piano keys, and across the children's hands, and across the floor that had once been a formal dining room and was now something more useful. The woman who had once been invisible in these rooms moved through them in the full light of a Saturday morning, and was visible, and was exactly where she had always been trying to get.